Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us. My name is Jenny Richards, and I'm very pleased to be starting off this session. I'm going to hand over to Professor Linda Pratt in a moment. A few words about the English Association. We're a learned society and subject association. We were founded in 1906 to promote, support, and celebrate the discipline of English studies. We cover all stages of education from primary and early years through to secondary and further education to higher education and beyond. We also cover all parts of the discipline across language, linguistics, literature, and creative writing. Events like this one are made possible by the fantastic contribution of our volunteer speakers, so many thanks to today's speaker, Elspeth Jiedelska. Our members make it possible to keep these events free and open to all by paying their membership fees. If you'd like to contribute to the national conversation about English and help support our discipline, please consider joining us. It costs around £1 per week to support our events and campaigning work for a whole year, and you'll get access to a range of member benefits, including online access to all our journals. Now it's my pleasure to hand over to Professor Linda Pratt, who is introducing our speaker and hosting our event. Over to you, Linda.
Thank you so much, Jenny, and hi everyone, and thank you very much for giving up the time to join us today for the latest in the series of events on collaboration. I'm delighted to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Elspeth Jiedelska, who is Senior Lecturer in English at Strathclyde University, and Elspeth's research is on cognition of literature. Today, she's going to talk about her collaboration with Chris Butler and Sinead Mullally on the role of aesthetic effects on narrative inference. And so, Elspeth, welcome, and over to you.
I think we have a picture of Sinead and Chris, and my collaborators. I'm afraid neither of them could be with us today. Chris was booked into another event a long time ago, and Sinead, I'm afraid, has been suffering for some poor health, but they're more than critical that none of this could have happened without them. So I did want to acknowledge their presence, and hopefully you can meet them another time. In the information available on this talk, there's information about the work I do, the kinds of things we're looking at in relation to literature and experience around literature. I think we can let Chris and Sinead go at this point, possibly. But what I thought I'd do with this brief 10 minutes or so that I'll use to introduce the whole topic is actually do a sort of narrative of how I came to be involved in cognitive approaches to literature and how I think that's shaped the kinds of things we're trying to do now as a group. I first got interested in anything to do with cognition when I noticed, and had noticed since childhood, that when I was reading fiction, when it got to faces, I couldn't picture the face. So I have a fairly good, vivid approach to reading. I can usually see what's being described. But when it got to faces, it would be particularly Victorian fiction. She had a lengthy nose, a commanding brow, a broad smile. And mentally, what I was seeing was all these things separately, the smile over there, the lengthy nose that way. And I was very curious about this, and I approached some people I happened to know, one of whom was Chris. Another was Katie Overy and other colleagues in psychology at Strathclyde. And I said, is there a reason for this? And they instantly said, oh, yes, face recognition is in a different section of the brain than most other recognition. Face recognition is special and it's holistic. You have to see the whole face altogether. So from that came the first article I published in this area, co-authored with all my collaborators at that time, about the nature of perception when you're reading, the imaginary perceived. And that was really the beginning of it all, very haphazard and so on. I got more and more interested and realised I needed greater competence to do some of the work I wanted to do. And so I combined, in a few years after that, between 2013 and 2015, I took my sabbatical as the first semester of a master's degree and then did part-time research for the other part of the master's degree. So over 2 years, I completed a master's degree in mind, language and embodied cognition. The reason I chose that particular programme was the leader of it, Professor Andy Clark, who is a very brilliant philosopher of cognition and who really helped me to rethink my understanding of cognition, to take it away from something that seems quite mechanistic in older models, where you perceive this, you process it like that, it leads to this, and something where all at once you're interpreting lots of things in a dynamic, changing way. And it was through Andy Clark's supervision of my dissertation that I did my next publication. And that was about how we process fiction. There are good, well-researched findings on this already, to do with how we use our existing understanding of the world, the way we divide time up into events, for example, the way we understand people's motivations, and we map them onto fiction. So in those respects, that understanding of fiction is a form of simulation. We take the real world and we simulate it. There's lots to be said for that. It is true in many cases and lots of the time. But as an English scholar and a lifelong passionate enthusiast, again, for fiction reading, it said, but that's all wrong. Why would you bother if you're just simulating the real world? The whole point is that fiction will alter the world, even if it's highly realist fiction in which nothing magical or even unlikely happens. The way in which it's written is creating a new world. And my dissertation let me use Andy's approach to those very kind of malleable understandings of cognition that are probability based and that can shift quickly in response to one thing or another, to write a version of how fiction might work in that way. The next steps from there, that was a theoretical piece of work, were how on earth would I start trying to show this? And this is where I turned again to Chris and to Sinead Mullally. I got 2 Royal Society of Edinburgh networking grants, one small and then a follow-on larger one. So over about 3 years or so, we had meetings with all kinds of people who have investments cognitively in fiction and narrative. And they were all very, very revealing. There was a lot of work around, again, the brain areas that are not normally associated with fiction processing, the brain areas around imagination and emotion, and the roles they might play. The fact that people who have all sorts of cognitive barriers to understanding fiction, sometimes, for example, from strokes, the key elements are missing that let them make the connections between one event in the narrative and another. So those sorts of psycholinguistic approaches let you narrow down what's really going on to some extent with fiction. And from there, we get to the last step, which was working much more closely with Sinead and with Chris to try and find experimental methods that would either confirm or disconfirm the beliefs I was beginning to form about how fiction really works. And that was painful for them. It was painful for me, but more painful for them. Because really, I never considered, well, I read a lot of experimental work, but what an experiment is, what its constraints are, what make it potentially robust or not robust, how you measure the findings, all of that was completely new to me. And it was a world of very, very constrained, fine-grained detail. So the way this worked was that I would have a go, I'd send it to Chris and Sinead, they'd say, no, not really. And that process continued until I had, all of us together had created a suite of potential experiments for which we could apply for funding. This is the moment where it all gets a bit sad. After all that work, I made 2 major funding applications, both of which failed and actually didn't get past the first hurdle. So where I am now is trying to think if there's smaller scale ways I could get started with this programme and maybe over time build it up. But I think it would be fair to say that between COVID and lots and lots of time spent on applications that don't get anywhere, and the sometimes difficulty of publishing this kind of work, there are moments where you wonder if it would have been easier to do something more straightforward. But from an intellectual point of view, it's been extraordinary and eye-opening, and really feel like I've grown and learned and done the things I wanted to do. So I think that's about me, Linda, if that sounds about...
That's perfect. Thank you so much, Elspeth. That's absolutely fascinating. Thank you. Brilliant. So the way we're going to run this then from now on, Inference, is I'll start with asking Elspeth a few questions, but then please do feel free to come in with your own questions and observations. That would be absolutely brilliant. You're welcome to raise your hand, but I'll also keep an eye on the chat as well. So if anyone wants to put something in the chat, please do so. But Elspeth, if I may begin, it's a fascinating project, really fascinating, really important. Could you touch on this already, but could you tell us a little bit more about how your collaboration came about? So, for example, you talked about identifying the Royal Society of Edinburgh grants and things like that. So there's kind of early stages, the kind of how thing. That would be brilliant. Thank you.
I think the key people, there have been various people at various points, and I think those 2 network grants were when there was the biggest number of people I was involved with. But really, the hard thinking, the really getting down to the details is not easy with big teams. And so for the bits where you actually try and make a breakthrough and develop a theory, for those, it really was Chris and Sinead I was very dependent on. The networks, they were valuable for just understanding how the rest of the world is thinking about this, and the different perspectives available, because I had very clear and quite firm views on what I thought was not working in the current accounts. But to get a bigger range of people and their concepts of what fiction is and how it works, I think that helped me be a bit less dogmatic, a bit more open-minded. So I think there's a kind of 2-tier thing between your core collaborators who you're just working with very intensely, and then the wider group of the academic community from different disciplines, sort of just stopping you going down too many blind alleys, I think.
Yeah, no, that's great. No, thank you. That's really helpful. I mean, as part of that, and sort of moving on a little bit, can you tell us a little bit more then about how your actual collaboration with Chris and Sinead worked? You've touched on it again, but some of that kind of that sort of day to day almost, or week to week kind of intermeshing of yourselves and kind of moving things forward.
So I think what was essential was having open-minded people who didn't mind that this wasn't going to get them career points. Because they inhabit different worlds, psychology and neuroscience, and those are worlds where, you know, it does depend a lot on having a pretty narrow focus on something, becoming highly specialized, and both of them were willing to jump out of that into something that didn't really exist as a field in some ways. So I think they were very driven by curiosity, and willing to perhaps, you know, not advance quite a quickly down. It wasn't hugely time consuming for them, but it was definitely a diversion. And I think all disciplines now tend to be highly focused on, you know, success in certain terms, and that can take you down a pretty narrow path. And some people are discouraged from saying, oh, but I thought I'd do this next. And well, no, but how does that relate to what you did before? You need to keep building up a sort of a profile. So that was absolutely key. The fact that they were willing to do this when it really wasn't clearly bringing them any particular benefits. And I was fortunate that way. I think it's not an accident that they're also both very able. I think that depth of curiosity and willingness to find out new things went with them being very able. They were also very able at explaining their discipline to me. Because it's one thing to kind of read the papers, and I got reasonably good at reading scientific papers, like everyone else in my position, skipping to the conclusion at the end, actually first. You know, but I clearly didn't know the technical detail of neuroimaging, for example. But I think what I hadn't quite appreciated is that even the much simpler experiments, the experiments where you ask someone to write something, you time them, those kinds of experiments are also extremely complex. They look simple, but actually you have to think through every possible error that might arise, every unexpected interpretation, consistency. Is it comparable with other results? Are they robust? That depth of focus on the detail of experimentation was something I certainly wouldn't be able to describe myself as able to do it in general. They helped me to manage that in very specific set of experiments with very specific goals, and to reinterpret what I was thinking, reframe it so that it could have an experimental way in, because, you know, it's not an easy thing to measure at all.
No.
You know, if fiction is incredibly complex, it's a complex experience, and trying to pick out the specific things you're trying to find out is very difficult indeed. So their support was absolutely critical. It was a mixture of good fortune and their openness that meant that they were there for me.
No, definitely. I mean, what do you think then? You and Sinead and Chris as well, actually, are able to do as a result of your collaboration that you couldn't do before?
I think it's that articulation of what it is we're trying to achieve, the clarity around it, and the way that a theory that I developed as a dissertation can be mapped onto what we already know about the world, and how it could be consistent or inconsistent with that. So that's a little bit abstract, but actually what that is a journey from one discipline to another in a lot of ways, and those disciplines talk different languages. So being able to learn how to talk the other discipline's language in terms of experimental science, that I think we've all learned, and they've learned much more about how the world seems to me. That we actually had meetings where we'd say, you know, well, in my world, this. And they'd say, oh yeah, but in my world, this. And I think that was really important in taking an idea that you think is important, but then trying to take it to the next step.
I mean, thank you. That's great. I mean, it seems to me that learning to speak the same language is so important. I mean, could you say a little bit more about some of the practical ways you did that you learned to kind of understand each other and write also?
And writing together. So the writing for the articles was draft upon draft. And in some ways, the most difficult bit of that is that it becomes too bitty. You know, here's something that this psychologist wanted in. Here's something that I wanted in because it's important for literary studies. We've got to refer to that person in literature, but also that person in psychology. And I think what I hadn't realised the paper on face cognition is the one that's had in some ways the most powerful afterlife. But that afterlife is the most unexpected area. It's to do with police effects. You know, if you're trying to identify a face and a person gives you a description, how far can you rely on the description for that reason? So it gets cited in very unexpected ways. So I think that it is difficult co-authoring across disciplines because you've got two different audiences who will both be critical. I think for the experiments and the grant application, again, the difficulty is none of us really know who our peer reviewers are going to be. I didn't know if we would have, for example, possibly two psychologists or a neuroscientist, or would they both be from humanities? So you're trying to future-proof every word you write against who you might get. For the legal hume, we never did find out. They don't disclose. If you don't get past the first hurdle, they don't tell you anything else about that. And for the HRC, it was turned out to be two psychologists. Now, I had tried to speak to every psychologist I could. Hey, am I missing something here? What would you go for if you were a peer reviewer? And in total, I spoke to about 5 psychologists and asked them to read it. Psychologists and neuroscientists. But in the end, we were caught up on the first peer review there by a very simple misunderstanding around terminology. So in sort of common speak around psychology, you can quite often say paper and pencil experiments, which doesn't mean literally that, but it means we're not doing any neuroscience, we're not doing anything with very complex machinery. It's sort of cheap, basically. And one of our readers read that literally as paper and pencil experiments with no timings, and that wasn't what we meant at all. And that was one of the things that we were faulted on that took us below the level. So it's really difficult, to be honest. I don't want to put everyone off. It's difficult enough as it is in the world of peer review for journals and for grants, but it does make it harder. That's definitely true.
Okay, thank you, Elspeth. Thank you, and thank you for talking so frankly as well. That's immensely helpful. So, if I may, I'm going to open up questions to everyone else here. So please do go ahead and ask questions, you're welcome to raise your hand or put questions in the chat. We do actually have one in the chat, so if I may begin with that. So if your collaborators had been able to join us today, Elspeth, what do you think they would say they got out of working with a specialist on literary fiction?
Oh, I think they really enjoyed it because it was stepping into something to do with personal enthusiasm. I think what a humanities researcher typically has is still, although it's more constrained than it used to be, but still this looks odd to me, I'll do this. I'll just write about it. And that's because in some ways we're quite cheap. If you give us a library and a computer, we can do what we need to do. And I think they really enjoyed that. I think they enjoyed the freedom to think very quickly, broadly, imaginatively, slightly outrageously about possibilities, and the feeling that I think in addition there's a whole range of questions in the worlds of neuroscience and psychology that need addressing and answered, and I think there is this, as I said earlier, this high level of specialization, and I think they love coming into our world where we speculate a lot. We try things out, we see if it works, we do all kinds of things, we can cover different historical periods, different genres. I think they enjoyed that sense that that's what an intellectual life can be. Because the more technical and the more expensive a subject becomes, which is the case for their subjects, I think the more narrow and constrained it can sometimes be as well. It gets harder, and I think there's more of a need to say, well, I'm a specialist in this, so that people can have faith in you. So yes, I think they really enjoyed it. They're both, Chris in particular is also someone who, he's a good musician. He likes literature. Sinead likes literature, and I think they enjoyed getting a little bit of an escape from those kind of tight constraints.
No, thank you, Elspeth. That's really, really helpful. Brilliant. Other questions, folks? Yes, Virginia, would you like to ask your question, or would you like me to read it out? I'm happy to read it if that's okay with you. Right, okay, so turning for a moment then from collaborative interdisciplinary processes to content, what sort of things do you think, Elspeth, you will eventually be able to tell literary scholars? What will be of key interest to us? Sorry, Virginia, I can't hear you, I'm afraid.
I think the thing that makes me feel very passionate about this project, even though I've been doing it for so long now, is this commitment to the importance of fiction, and not seeing fiction as just maybe a short route to helping children learn to read, although that's wonderful, it can do that, and not seeing it just as something that shows you've reached a certain level of comprehension or something like that. But the fact that fiction, any kind of fiction, in my opinion, is actually requiring us as we read to reinvent the world somewhat. So I think I said at the beginning that I think that's true even of the most strictly realist fiction. That merely by putting it into words and those words having an effect together that are maybe unexpected and not to do with what's in the real world, also to do with the fact that when we read, or when somebody is performing, if you think of reading as a performance done by a silent person, originally all fiction was done live by people speaking. So what it is a performative act. And one of the things we know about performance is that we lose our personas. So the me that goes around, teaching, marking, doing all those things. When I become an audience member, I become something else. I become someone who's involved in evaluating, interpreting, and myself to some extent gets turned off. And there is sort of evidence around that. If there's nice experiments where if you give someone the same text and you tell one person it's fiction and another fact, they read them differently. If you think it's fact, you'll pay a lot of attention to parts in the text that are about action and movement. Just as in real life, when we see people around us acting, we respond, we pay attention because it might affect us positively or negatively. Whereas when the readers know it's fiction, they turn a lot of that off. And that gives them space to step back, be someone else, and therefore reinterpret what's happening in the world. And I think that power of fiction to make everyone a creator, everyone recreates the world as they read in order to make sense of that text. They make it a world in which sunshine is more likely or rain is more likely than in normal life, where generosity or any of the major emotions is increased or decreased in various ways. And it's a systemic effect across the whole text. So I think that passion for fiction is more than we think it is. Fiction is essential. Fiction is important. The fact that reading numbers are falling among young people should be a huge alarm going off. And the fact that we know fiction improves people's capacities even in unrelated topics like maths. That, I think, is the thing that drives me most and still keeps me very interested in the topic. Sorry, that was a long answer.
Sorry, just unmuting. Thank you, Elspeth. That was really, really, really helpful. Thank you. Kathy Howell also has a question. Kathy, are you happy for me to read it? Please raise your hand if you're not. Kathy's here is an English teacher and teacher educator for training English teachers. So she's interested in your thoughts, Elspeth, or to hear about how your work links to the role of the English classroom.
I think this is where one of the difficulties is with not being able to get the experiments done, because I think it is quite correct that we shouldn't be taking to teachers theories that are not proven or not got evidence behind them. So it's not the workshops we did. I did work with small numbers of students around those issues, but it was in a framework of here's something interesting rather than here's how you should approach this. I think also I have a lot of respect, I should hope I would, for the teaching profession, for the teachers in the classroom who know what they're doing a lot better than I do. So I wouldn't want to be someone who goes into the classroom and says, here's my findings, and now here's what you should do. I think the model I would prefer it, again, if we can fund the experimentation, is find out what the experiments might show, find out if I'm more or less right, and then find the best avenues to take that into schools. I think in the shorter term, though, I do sometimes talk about the potential for this being the case, for my theory being correct, as something that at least can get people excited. It ought to be easy to get people excited about fiction, but as I say, we all know we're living in difficult times for fiction reading, at every age group really, until you get to oldies. And I think anything that can help advertise it, support it, encourage, I'd be behind, even if it is on the basis of things that, so long as you disclose it, are not yet fully proven.
Thank you, Elspeth. Great, thank you. We have another question, very topical one as well, from Karen McGivern. And Karen asks, has your research or your area of interest given you any thoughts on how we can actually address that reduction of reading in younger people, how we can encourage younger people to read?
Yeah, I mean, the only ones I can think of are the ideas of giving them making people more aware of the evidence, because those of us who are interested in it, we see the PISA findings, we see how important reading and fiction reading is in particular, but I don't think that gets out there much. So I think taking what we already know to be its beneficial effects, and just aggressive is the wrong word, but being, again, less shy, more emphatic, insisting that this needs the kind of attention that's routinely given to STEM. I think also the mistake that continues, that humanities and English degrees are not good for jobs. And I know Jenny does so much wonderful work on this, and the English Association do, and I think it's the right kind of work. I think it's just trying to get it out there. A, this will not be bad for your career, on the contrary, and B, this is well researched. It's not waffly people insisting that their pet project has to be looked at. So anything that can push those two, I think, will be helpful.
Thank you, Elspeth. That's great. Thank you. Any more questions? Please do post them in the chat. Jenny, did you?
So, yeah. Yes, I've got a question in my. So apologies, everybody. We're learning to use webinar, and I needed to allow you individually to talk. So now we can see all the names. But I wanted to come back, so I apologize for that. Please forgive us. But Elspeth, I'm really taken with what you said about the challenges of getting interdisciplinary research funded. I mean, we know, everybody knows that we need to move into the space of interdisciplinary research, protecting disciplines, etc., but actually create pathways to cross collaboration. All the reasons that you've talked about, it's mind expanding. You can do different things. You can scale up. What advice might you have for funding bodies?
I think if there was space for genuinely high risk, because I think quite often schemes will advertise, this is for high risk, it's for new work, but then you look at what comes out and you think that's not looking scarily new to me. It has to be slightly, I think it's very difficult for funders because understandably, we've all been on panels. You don't want to be the panel member that's enthusiastically shouts yes for the thing that turns out to be a big disaster and gets into the papers. And so there's an inherent bias to caution, I think. And I think caution, even for the things that look like they're very innovative, but they've actually possibly been around for quite a while. Genuine risk, where I would freely admit I could do my experiments and just be wrong. And then I'll just be right back at the beginning again. That's just how it is. But we won't find out unless someone takes the risk. So I think either it's sort of reserving streams for high risk, making them low money. I don't need gazillions and gazillions to do this. But of course, for the funding councils, it's often easier to work with large things. So if there were small pots of money for things that were genuinely a little bit alarming in the sense that there's every possibility this could fail, that would be helpful, I think.
Thank you.
If I could follow up then from Jenny's question, if that's okay, Elspeth. You talked about picking up the project and finding small scale ways of taking it forward. Could you tell us something about that sort of work? 'Cause it's work that we all find ourselves in that position where something we really want to do doesn't get funded, or there are barriers to it that seem insuperable. And so kind of that sort of picking up, moving on. It'd be fantastic if you could tell us a little bit about your thinking and your colleagues' thinking in that space too.
Yeah, I mean, at a sort of cheap psychology level, like, allow yourself a little bit of a cry. Don't feel, oh, well, let's move straight on. Allow yourself to feel, they take months, these applications. We all know that. You just need to give yourself a moment before you move on. I then spoke to a very eminent psychologist in the field of fiction processing. It's his model that I think is both very good, but not enough. That I'm challenging in some ways. And I just asked his advice, and he doesn't know me. He was very kind of me to take some time. But he suggested a think aloud experiment is something that doesn't require quite such experimental precision in terms of timings and accuracies. It's you invite people literally to think aloud while they read. But it can give you something. It's not up to the normal experimental standards of psychology, but it's nothing either. It's a perfectly respectable method. And it's one I could potentially do on my own if I'll ask for some advice. It's time consuming. You record maybe 20 people, you have to then analyze all that, what they've said and so on. But I could do it without a research assistant. And that would be like my research for quite a lengthy period of time. But if I can do that and get that published, that might be the step that would make it easier for someone else to say, yes, we can fund this. So that's, yeah, I think I do feel a little bit burnt out by funding applications, by sometimes the difficulty of getting people to publish because it all seems a bit odd. So, I don't really feel I'm going to go straight back into another big grant application without clearer insight into what might make it successful. So I think that's my next step.
Thank you, Elspeth. That's immensely helpful. It really is. We've got a comment from Anna Maria in the chat that the underfunding of humanities is an issue, as you rightly point out, but also the structural barriers. So, for example, the need to produce referable outputs without any time or space to devote time to something that may actually not work. So it's that kind of structural thing as well as underfunding as well. Thank you, Anna Maria, for mentioning that too. That's really helpful, and thanks for talking so frankly and helpfully, Elspeth. It's it's that situation we've all been in. I've cried many times, is what I will say at this point. But thank you. Yeah, yes, complete agreement with Anna Maria. Absolutely. Any other questions anyone would like to ask? Okay, if I may, then if you had some top tips or advice you would give to anyone thinking either now or say thinking about it in the longer term as well about collaborating, what advice would you give them? I guess kind of do's and don'ts or things to be wary of or to think that are important to think about before you actually begin the collaboration.
I think I've been really fortunate. I've had really able, really interesting people almost teach me, and that's lucky. And that luck came from just talking to my personal friendship groups. It wasn't professional network groups. It was just people I happened to know. Is somebody through music, really, pianist, who knew about Chris. And so I think don't scorn that as a pathway. I think it's quite easy to sort of think the only way to do this is institutionally. So I'll get myself a network grant and then I'll meet all the right people and then and normally, of course, there are big problems with the idea of just talking to your friends because that can lead to biases, it can lead to specific groups being left out of things. But I do think it's important that it's someone you really get on with and who understands and values what you're trying to do, not just kind of, oh, you need my help. Well, I don't know why you want to do this, but this is what you should do. It needs to be someone who thinks, oh, that sounds really interesting. It's not something I know how to do. Between us, we can work this out. So I would, whatever the method of actually finding individuals, prioritize their enthusiasm, I think, maybe over, for example, their eminence. Although the eminence can be helpful with things like raising your profile. But that wasn't my path.
Okay, thank you. That's brilliant. Sorry, I'm just. Oh yes, Anna Maria has a question. That's okay, Elspeth. Would you consider a more humanities-friendly approach, which may not draw on the controlled experiment? Anna Maria writes that she understands empirical work in humanities is more easily validated with the scientific model, but that she's grappling with the desire to develop a literary studies methodology that draws on science rather than borrows from it.
I think that's absolutely fair. And I don't think anyone needs to go down my path with just to do work around science and humanities. And so the big thing that I did, which was my dissertation, that was done without any assistance or support from scientists. That was done in a context of a philosophy of cognitive science. It was informed by cognitive science. It certainly didn't have any experimental elements. And that was the thing that the foundation for all of my ideas around this. So I think, yes, it is easy to sort of think science is hard and correct and what we do is silly, and that's not the case at all. And it is possible to have combined the two in different ways than trying to create experiments. Experiments for me have been the last step where I want to actually persuade the world that this is important, but it's definitely not the first step.
Thank you, Elspeth. That's great. Any further questions, anyone? Yes, Ivan. Yes, Ivan Callas. So Ivan writes, fiction is a wonderfully and magically large category. Absolutely. Apart from literary fiction, it can comprise jokes, digital games, various genres across film, TV, all kinds of play, etc. Would your research be looking at these kind of comparative aspects, Elspeth?
No, but not from a principled reason, from a time reason. It's literally taken me decades or more, something like decades, most of my career, to get to the point where I am now. I think it would be great if there were other people out there considering the many different branches of fiction, but I have stuck to my thing because it's time consuming. But I think that doesn't mean at all that I think it's because the other possibilities aren't good. I will say this, though, that I think there is something. So one of the things we did as a result of the network grant was an article on comparing word-only fiction with image-based fiction, both, and not so much animation, but cartoons as well as films. And there are differences. They're not necessarily differences of value, but it's not easy to just elide all these things together. And it was the case that in the more vision-based work, you've got a higher sense of a collective opinion. There was less variation between viewers than there were between readers. And what that suggests is that readers are developing something very autonomously in their heads. Whereas as soon as you bring in visual elements, they're giving you a framework. Both can be valuable, particularly struggling readers. Having a framework is always a good thing. But in terms of just that kind of freedom to reinvent the world in ways that are statistically not the case in the real world, I think fiction might have a bit of an edge.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Elspeth. That's brilliant. Any further questions? Anyone? Well, if not, thank you very much, Elspeth. That was absolutely amazing. And thank you for answering so many questions in such great detail. And thanks also for everyone who asked those questions. I'm now going to pass over to Jenny. Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry, Jenny. Before we do so, Rachel's just posted one final question. Elspeth, could you please recommend where we might begin to read about your research findings? Sorry.
Oh, so I have a really unusual surname, and if you just put that into Scholar Google, you'll get anything I've ever done. And I think the titles are hopefully fairly clear, but I'm open to correspondence if anyone's got further questions on the detail.
Brilliant, thank you. And Jenny, over to you.
Thank you so much, Elspeth. I hope you can see from the questions that you were getting. There's another question.
Sorry.
And actually, Regina, everybody should be able to speak. Regina, do you want to ask your question now? Your hand went up.
No, I was just going to send one of those little hearts thanking you when it was over, but not the hand. Thanks anyway.
Yeah, I mean, you can see how interested people are in the topic. And there was something that you said about decline in reading for pleasure. We know this from the work of the National Literacy Association, and how that is tied to the development of young people. And so your work is really important, and I can see it resonated with a lot of people. I hope we will hear from you again, Elspeth. Thank you so much for this. But can I also thank everybody for coming along today, for bearing with me as I manage this new Zoom webinar system, and for your absolutely brilliant questions. I put in the chat the link to further EA events, and I hope I'll see you. I hope we will see you at those again. But thank you, everybody. I'm going to stop the recording now.